This is Evan Blake with the World Socialist website and the Global Workers' Inquest into the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I'll be interviewing Tim Yoder, who has been a flight attendant in the United States for over 30 years. Tim, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Tim caught COVID in March 2020. He was hospitalized for roughly a month, including 19 days on a ventilator, a horrific ordeal, which he will describe in detail in just a moment. We just had the third Thanksgiving of the pandemic, which saw record travel, and we're now heading into the third winter surge with no protections in place. In the US, the official death toll recently surpassed 1.1 million, and the Biden administration acknowledges that at least 50,000 more Americans could die this winter. Tim, can you start by describing your experiences at the beginning of the pandemic in February and March of 2020?
When the pandemic started, we knew something was going on. I mean, just like anybody else, we just, from the news reports, I was flying at least once a week, sometimes twice a week to Europe, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and London. I had done some back-to-back London trips, and then my final Amsterdam trip was on March 13th. Going over, coming back on the 15th. On the 14th, I had two further Amsterdam trips the next week. And they were during that trip that on the 14th, they were both canceled. And so we all were not sure what was going on. All of our crews from the Delta system were all concentrated at this one hotel in Europe for, all the various bases that you had. There might have been 10, 12 crews a night staying there. All of us probably exposed in some form or the other. And I think it's worthwhile to note that we were being moved, since they were shutting all the flights down, we were being moved from that hotel. And that Monday, the last crew that left that hotel in Amsterdam, they had the doors locked behind them by people in hazmat suits because they shut the hotel down.
You're describing in March, mid-March 2020, when you were still going on flights, you were told that you were an essential worker.
I was wondering if I was actually ill or I had a temperature. You will go on your flight. And I remember I felt a little odd about that because I've been told that I was surrounded by people that tested positive, and I was thinking I probably should I should quarantine, and my management saying, no, you just do as you're told. I believe I was going downhill. I didn't realize it. It took a long time. I've always been extraordinarily healthy. I'm an avid lap swimmer. I've averaged 3 miles of swim, over 3 miles a week of swimming for now 28 years. At that point, it was 26 years. And I had a persistent cough. But in the winter, I frequently have a cough. It didn't necessarily alarm me. I called my doctor, and they wanted nothing to do with me. They just said, "Oh no, I want to get a test." And they said, "If you get a test, you have to go to the hospital." Well, I didn't want to go to a hospital. I'd never go to the hospital for flu or a cold. And so I think what possibly saved my life was my other coworkers getting sick, because it was something I would not normally have. It gave me the impetus to go get tested, even though I didn't want to. I had to go to the emergency room. They wanted to know why I was there, and I just said I wanted to get a test. Well, why do you want a test? Because it was difficult to get tests then. You had a really good reason. And I said I was an international flight attendant, and I think I maybe mentioned my colleagues were getting sick. They were instantly interested. I had a fever I didn't realize I had. I believe they did x-rays. There was clouding in my lungs. The next thing I know was that I'm in a cubicle with a female doctor, and she mentions a number of things. I didn't really pay attention, But the bottom line was that she was going to admit me. On the 28th of March, they intubated me. So I was there afternoon of 26th till the evening of the 28th. They intubated me. I can honestly say I didn't know what that meant. Especially at that time, I asked my older brother, who became the hospital's liaison with me. It was like COVID was bad. Ventilators good because all the world was going crazy over ventilators. We need ventilators. We're desperate. And I guess the impression was that if you had a ventilator, you'd be okay.
Yeah.
And that's my impression. I did not know that a ventilator meant that's what they pulled the plug on. I didn't know that was end of life stuff. I've talked to people since then whose family members have passed, and what they've asked is, I think they wanted to know what did their family members experience. It was like a nightmare. It really was. But you felt, I felt like I was, well, you had difficulty breathing, but you had all this stuff down your throat. I had all these IVs in my neck. I felt like an octopus. I was tied down. There was a level of claustrophobia that I still have difficulty with. I'm in the ICU at the hospital, and I'm on one of those beds that undulate to keep bed sores at bay, and
Right.
I'm kind of an angle. But with being tied down and having this feeling of the bed moving and being unable to breathe, I just, the only thing I felt I was in quicksand. That was the general mental state that I was in quicksand. I couldn't see much, of course, because I didn't have my contacts in. Everything was a blur. I was on the ventilator for 19 days, 3 different, it was failing. I pulled it out one night. I got loose and pulled it out, which almost did me in. One of the more horrific aspects, besides the feeling of I was in quicksand, was horrific thirst. And another thing, hindsight's 2020, but if I could tell medical staff to do anything, is to let people like in my position know you're not dying of thirst. You're getting all this stuff pumped into you, all these bags of IVs and that. What they would do is they could brush my teeth, and they could do this horrific, awful gel stuff to moisten. But it was so awful. I didn't let them do that. But I would find myself trying, when they brushed my teeth, to try and swallow the whatever, any amount. And it was just, the washing their hands in the ICU room, flushing the toilet after they had changed the waste, the bag. Just the sound of rushing water was just torture. I had these fantasies that I could get up, and who knew that I didn't know I couldn't move at all, but I could go over and, like, when no one was around, I'd slurp under the sink or something like that. And it asked me, sometimes it just say, do you need anything? Or else I couldn't tell them. I'd do this, and it was like, oh no, can't have that. There was such a great barrier. I couldn't talk. I couldn't I couldn't even tell who was really ministering to me, the workers. You're in kind of a twilight, I guess. I don't know. There were times it just seemed like never ending. Effectively, though, everything was failing, and there were periods of time. At one point in my brother's on the Facebook was that the doctor gave me 50-50. Well, even I knew that 50-50 probably meant 90-10. That's how I didn't feel it was 50-50. As everything was failing, the doctors came to me and said that they were going to try a trach and a peg tube, because I was also losing a lot of weight. I mean, I was intravenous feeding, but I had a feeding tube. And if I agreed to that, they said that I would probably, there was a possibility of recovery. And I have to admit, mentally, it was difficult for me to go from this super healthy person to to you're dying. It wasn't brought out to me that the trach was temporary. The problem with the trach was that, as a matter of fact, on here, still you can. I had it, all these little white spots, and I couldn't figure out what those were for the longest time. And I realized, oh, those are all the IVs that they had in my neck. But my grandfather had a trach, but he spoke with an electronic box. In agreeing to that, I felt that effectively if I lived, my life would be as an invalid. That my swimming's gone, my career's gone. I'd be talking like a robot. I was, and so I had to make a decision. Did I want to live? But if I lived, did I want to live as an invalid? And then there was no guarantee that I would live. I mean, that didn't even work. But they were trying everything. So I decided I wanted to live. So they did the trach, and then unfortunately they did the peg tube without going to an operating room. They did it in the ICU room, and that was the most horrific thing that probably happened to me while I was in the hospital. I ended up getting PTSD from that. That was horrific. They said, "Oh, we were able to do it chairside. It went really well." And I remember reading that weeks later. It was like, no, it was absolutely horrific. It was hard for me to be brutalized, and I could see people's feet. My vision was that I could see people's feet surrounding me. No one was going to protect me from this guy because he was the surgeon. No one was going to go against him. And I understand that now, but it didn't make it any easier. And I eventually, in terms of, it was getting these threats that if I didn't, it kept going, yelling, screaming at me, or seemed like screaming, "Swallow, Tim, swallow. If we don't do this, we'll just have to keep doing it." Eventually it worked out because I don't know, maybe I passed out or whatever. I don't think they did an anesthetic. They might have, but when I came to, I guess it was successful. They put this claw thing down your throat to anchor it in your stomach, as from what I understand. Well, anyway, I will say that once they had the trach and the peg tube and I was getting nutrition, I started to improve. They tried something called a Passi-Mira valve that was on the trach, and I found I could talk. Maybe not great, but pretty good. But I could talk. Well, all of a sudden, I remember saying to the nurse, "I can talk," and she just kind of said, "Well, of course you can talk. We didn't take your voice box." And then I remembered my grandfather had lost his voice box due to cancer. He had cancer of the throat. Well, then I was thinking, well, maybe if this heals, all of a sudden, I think mentally well, I can talk. I can make, well, when it heals, I can sing, or I can swim. Well,
Right.
as long as I have my voice, I can go back to work. And that became my goal. I was getting some therapy, but I didn't know at the time that I'd have to learn how to walk again. I'd lost all total, I couldn't get up. It took two people to get me up on the side of a bed. After 30 days, they transferred me at the hospital. They had a long-term acute care hospital within the hospital. It was on a different floor and still in negative pressure. They transferred me there. And I was there probably a week and a half, maybe, or so. At which time I had to have 2 negative tests, COVID tests, before I could move out of that. And once that was accomplished, I went kind of general population for about maybe, I don't know, I think it was less than a week. So when I left, I was in ICU for 30 days. I left Mercy Medical 20 days after that. So I was there for 50 days. they of course would rather you didn't go to rehab. They'd rather you do it at home or whatever. And their primary thing was, well, who can look after you when you're home? And I said that would be no one. And I said, my gallbladder rebelled due to the peg tube, the high fat content of the food for the intravenous feeding. So that set me back. And they did not have to remove my gallbladder. I just had to drink water for 5 days.
Hmm.
But when they were starting rehab, it took 2 people to get me up on the side of a bed, 2 people to get me on a walker, 2 people to move me like a step over. I have to admit, I was horrified by that I had lost the ability to walk. That was a big surprise. So I told the hospital, I need rehabilitation. I need to be independent. I need to be able to drive to the pharmacy to get groceries. I mean, I there's no one to look after me. So I requested and was able to go to my mother's nursing home. They had set up an isolation section in the nursing home. And I was probably maybe the first person accepted there at that time. This would have been, I think it was May 14th.
Hmm.
And I was there until June 1st. And I went in, I was on a walker. I had lost over 50 pounds. And
This was just after you had left the hospital?
yes, I went, they transported me to the nursing home. But the good thing was that I was able to see my mother. My mother was 91. Her older sister was 93. And it was so bizarre because my mother was not on a cane or wheelchair or walker. And here I am, here's her son, who was such a physical wreck. And she would come in, deliver the paper, and just like shake her head, and I'd be struggling around. And so she pretty much came every day to see me. They let her do that. June 1st, the COVID got into the hospital, into the nursing home 6 weeks later. And it went through like fire through dry grass. My aunt passed away. My mother wasn't sick then. 2 days later, my mother tested positive. My mother was gone within a week. My mother died within a week. So I lost my aunt and my mother in a week. My sister, though, got sick and she ended up in the hospital. She never even got to my mother's funeral. I ran into my respiratory nurse about 6 weeks after I got out. It was on July 4th in my town, my little town where I live. I knew she was there, and I remember she recognized me because they were all masked and gowned. I never was. They always, and so she said, "Tim," I was at a park. They're getting ready for some fireworks, and I knew it had to be her. And so I talked to her and her husband, and I remember when I left the ICU, there had been a video of it, and it was like kind of a big deal. Both shifts saw me off, and this nurse said it was a very big deal. And that's when I asked her, I said, "Did you lose people?" And her only answer was, "Most." I found out later that, that 8 to 10 days on a ventilator is like 80 to 100% chance of dying. And I was 19 days, and people that knew about ventilators, which I didn't, would tell people to ask their kids or whatever who are in healthcare, this guy's our friends on this ventilator, and they would say, "Well, don't want to tell you this, but he's probably not going to make it." Last October, a year ago, I had lost my first cousin actually, to pass away. I'm like 36. On my mother's side, 52 years old, he died on a ventilator in Alabama. And
October 2021.
2021, a year after all. In December of 2020, my brother, who was a nursing home administrator, got severe COVID. He was hospitalized, and fortunately, in his case, his lungs are ruined. So, and it was in every bit as good or better shape physically than I was, but he has pulmonary fibrosis now, and he fights. He works. He still works. He works out, but he's lost probably a third to a half of his lung capacity. And of course, it's eventually considered fatal.
If you look at the official statistics now on worldometers, there's now been just over 1.1 million Americans who have died from COVID since the beginning of the pandemic, and there's nothing like it in U.S. history in terms of the number of people who have died. It's far more than the Civil War, and even more than the Civil War and all the wars of the 20th century combined. Sure. And I guess when you were describing really these, the horrific conditions that you experienced, and what you just said that 80 to 90% of people who are intubated, would pass away. It brought to mind, at this time, the U.S. President Donald Trump was comparing COVID to the flu, and he had been told in early February. It was later revealed by Bob Woodward. I don't know if you followed that at the time, but he had been told by the Chinese President Xi Jinping that the virus, is much more deadly than the flu and more dangerous, and that it spreads through the air. But he was publicly saying that it would go away by April. That it was basically not more dangerous than the flu. And I guess I was wondering if you might want to speak to that and sort of just the effort. Yeah.
My feeling on that is that I don't know if it's the right word to say. I guess I was essentially a COVID denier, if you want. I mean, I knew it was out there. I think a lot of people don't understand was the comorbidities. I didn't have those. I mean, I remember that. Right. That's what stunned everybody. That's what stunned my illness. Gave the impetus for people. I saw on Facebook, people said if Tim Yoder could get sick, none of us are safe. And some, I know with one couple, men and women, both flight attendants, for their elderly parents and their kids, they both took the leaves. I had a number of people say, I took the leaves because of you. And that's what was so, for lack of a better word, humbling to me.
Yeah.
Was that I remember they asked me, they said, well, what prescription meds do you take? And I go, none. And I found out later that someone in my age group in the early 60s might have several different or more, half a dozen medications. And I go, none. They go, well, what non-prescription drugs do you take? I go, none. I said, I don't even like taking an aspirin. If I have a headache, I have a headache. I don't think to reach for a bottle for something. It's just
you're incredibly healthy for your age.
But it didn't, Evan. It didn't matter. I was incredibly healthy, and I still almost lost my life. And so, and so, if people say I'm a walking, talking miracle, that's true. But in terms of early on, there was so much. I remember a friend of mine that sent me. From California, sent me allegedly these pictures from China. This was taken in like early January, and it was supposedly pictures of, I don't know, might have been Wuhan, whatever, but all these like fog machines, people all dressed out, fog machines to these empty city streets, and it was just so fantastic. You couldn't grasp it. I couldn't grasp it, but I thought, and talking about comorbidities. I mean, I remember asking a lady in the hospital. This was when I was recovering. I remember and the crystallization of your lungs could happen so quickly. There was a registered nurse in the hospital. I believe it was that hospital. I believe she's 56. Went maybe wasn't feeling well, whatever. Went to bed that night, died in her sleep. And that's this nurse said. I said, well, what if I hadn't come in? She said, you probably would have died in your sleep.
Tim, thank you for sharing your experiences with the WSWS Global Workers Inquest. I encourage everyone watching today to share this video widely and fill out the form below the video to participate in the inquest. We are exposing the massive social crime that has taken place over the past 3 years and which is ongoing despite all the lies, that the pandemic is over. Share your stories from the pandemic to inform others and hold accountable those who are responsible.